He was just a kid, young, quiet, and full of dreams. But to a group of officers, he wasn't seen as a child at all. Their laughter wasn't playful. It was cruel, cutting, and fueled by prejudice. They thought he was powerless, someone they could dismiss without consequence. But what they didn't know was that this moment would flip their world upside down, because behind the boy they mocked stood a truth so powerful, it demanded respect. What happens when arrogance collides with justice? It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon. The boy had spent the day at school, eager to get back home where his mother was waiting with his favorite meal. Like most kids his age, he carried his backpack slung low, his sneakers scuffed from playground games, and his head full of dreams about the future. On the surface, he was no different from any other child, innocent, hopeful, and still learning how wide the world could be. But there was something about him that often drew unwanted attention. His skin, his presence, his confidence. It was enough for some to see him not as a child, but as a threat. He'd grown used to the stares, the whispers, the way strangers crossed the street when he walked by. Yet on this day, something felt heavier in the air, like the calm before a storm. As he strolled through the quiet neighborhood, the sound of distant chatter and footsteps grew louder. A group of uniformed officers stood nearby, their eyes narrowing as they watched him approach. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking, existing, but their smirks said otherwise. The boy didn't know it yet, but this walk home was about to become a lesson, not just for him, but for the very people who thought they could laugh at his existence without consequence. What was about to unfold would challenge every assumption in the air that afternoon. The laughter started small, just a few chuckles that echoed off the empty street. At first, the boy thought it wasn't about him. He kept walking, clutching the straps of his backpack, determined to ignore it. But then he heard the words, sharp and unmistakable. "Look at him. Thinks he belongs here." The sound of boots shifted on the pavement, and suddenly their attention was locked on him. His chest tightened. He hadn't done anything wrong, but experience had already taught him that innocence didn't matter. To them, his skin was enough of an excuse. He slowed his steps, trying to decide whether to keep walking or stop, but before he could, one of the officers stepped forward. The others followed, smirking, amused as though this moment were entertainment. They circled him, not with weapons drawn, but with words dripping in condescension. Their tone wasn't just mocking, it was dismissive, the kind of laughter reserved for someone they believed was powerless. Every laugh felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, every smirk a reminder of the centuries of judgment he carried with him. He tried to steady his breathing, but their voices only grew louder. One leaned in, pretending to inspect his backpack, while another whispered something that made the group erupt in cruel laughter. To them, he wasn't a child with dreams. With a family waiting at home, he was a target, someone to belittle simply because of who he was. Passers-by glanced quickly and then looked away, unwilling to get involved. That silence, the silence of those who chose not to see, was almost worse than the laughter. His heart pounded, and for a moment, fear surged through him. What if this escalated? What if their cruelty turned into something worse? But even as fear swirled inside him, another thought took root. He wasn't alone, not really. There was a truth about his life, a truth about his father, that none of them knew. The weight of that secret gave him strength, though he kept his eyes down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his spirit break. The officers laughed louder, pushing the moment as far as they could. They thought they were in control. They thought he was just another kid who would swallow the humiliation and move on. But they were wrong, because what was about to happen would turn their laughter into silence and leave them wishing they had never crossed paths with him. The laughter hit its peak when one officer shoved his shoulder, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to send a message. You don't matter here. The boy's heart thundered in his chest, fear mixing with humiliation as the circle around him tightened. Their voices blurred together, mocking questions, cruel jokes, each word cutting deeper than the last. For a moment, he felt small, just a kid trapped under the weight of uniforms and authority. He thought of his mother waiting at home, of the lessons his father had taught him about standing tall, about dignity in the face of hate. But here, surrounded by laughter that wasn't laughter at all, only cruelty, even those lessons felt like they were slipping away. Then, in the middle of the chaos, a familiar sound pierced the air, the low, steady hum of an approaching black SUV. The officers paused, just for a second, glancing at the car rolling to a stop at the curb. The back door opened, and out stepped a man in a dark suit, posture straight, expression unreadable. The boy's breath caught. His father. The laughter drained from the air like someone had flipped a switch. The officers' smirks faltered as the man's presence filled the street with a gravity none of them could ignore. He didn't have to raise his voice, didn't have to brandish power. His very identity carried weight. This wasn't just any father. This was the FBI director. The officers who had mocked, who had laughed without restraint, now stood frozen, their confidence collapsing under the realization of who they had ridiculed. The boy, still standing in the center of their circle, finally felt the shift. Fear gave way to something else, something stronger. For the first time, the balance of power had turned. The silence that followed was louder than any insult. The officers who once laughed now stood stiff, eyes darting between the boy and the man who had just stepped from the SUV. Authority had shifted in an instant, and with it, the weight of their actions pressed down on them like a crushing tide. For the boy, it wasn't victory he felt. It was exhaustion, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away, simply because of the color of his skin. His father placed a steady hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the circle of shame. No words were needed. The boy knew that the power in that moment wasn't in titles or badges, it was in the truth revealed. Those who had mocked him now understood what they could not erase. The humanity they had tried to deny was undeniable. But as they walked away, the boy realized something deeper. If his father hadn't been who he was, the story might have ended very differently. And that truth was the most painful of all. Respect shouldn't depend on status. Safety shouldn't depend on privilege. Justice shouldn't depend on luck. This story is not just about one child, one father, or one group of officers. It's about a system that still allows laughter to echo where respect should live. It's about every child who walks home wondering if the world will see them as human or as a threat. So the question lingers. How many more must endure humiliation, fear, or worse before change becomes more than a promise? And when the laughter fades, will we finally choose to listen?